Okay, so I'd like to welcome everybody to this annual School of Archaeology lecture. So these are the Meyerstein Lectures, and this year I'd like to thank Merton as well for enabling us to have the lecture here in this lovely lecture theatre. But particularly to thank Joanna Brück, who's come to give us our lecture this year. And to introduce her, got Chris Gosden.
Well, it's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Joanna Brück. I've just dropped my notes. Who is head of the School of Archaeology in the University College Dublin.
Not anymore.
Oh, not anymore. Okay, right. Okay. Is that because of the EIC? Oh, well done. Right. She's not head of the School of Archaeology because she's got a very large EIC grant, which we'll hear about in a minute. Yes, Jo's a great friend and intellectual inspiration to many of us here. She's worked on a whole range of things, two broad areas of research. One is the Easter Uprising, where you've also got a current grant, or you've just...
I do,
yes. Yeah, many different grants. And the other is the Bronze Age of Ireland and Britain. So she's written Personifying Prehistory, Relational Ontologies in Britain and Ireland in the Bronze Age. She has also, people here, participated in a project on technologies, bronze technologies. A book came out, The Social Context of Technology. Some of my favourite of her recent papers is Jo critiquing human genetics from an archaeological point of view and trying to restrain some of the more hyperbolic statements that the geneticists are making. Her current project, as we just mentioned, is Animals and Society in Bronze Age Europe, funded by the European Research Council, and that's the topic of her talk tonight, which is the social world of Bronze Age animals. Jo, please.
Thank you very much, Chris, for that very kind introduction. So I'm really, really thrilled to be here and very honoured to have been asked to give this year's Meyerstein Lecture. I was very tempted to talk to you about revolutionary ghosts, which is a paper I'm writing about, another paper I'm writing at the moment. But I thought because there are so many prehistorians in Oxford, I probably ought to come and talk about the Bronze Age. So that's what I have decided to do. So it's lovely to be here amongst friends and colleagues. So Bronze Age Europe, of course, is often viewed as the first globalized economy, a period in which technological innovation, long-distance trade and agricultural intensification facilitated the creation of wealth, increasing interpersonal competition and the emergence of institutionalized forms of social difference. So this is very much seen as a stepping stone towards the modern world. And central to developments of the period were the activities of male warriors, traders, chiefs and metalworkers. And of course, this is a really colonial narrative. So women, artifacts, materials and resources, land and animals are all figured as objects of economic exploitation and masculine control. And in this sense, we're presented with a vision in which competitive individualism, violence and warfare are naturalized as a significant component in an evolutionist narrative. And I suppose that all of this sounds suspiciously familiar to contemporary ears. It feels like we're imposing anachronistic and androcentric ways of understanding the world onto the past. And I think that these interpretations are really predicated on modes of thinking characteristic of the modern Western world, in which the dualisms, dichotomies, self, other, subject, object, culture, nature, man, woman, are all kind of operationalized in the way in which we think about the period. Now, I've, as some of you will know, spent a lot of my professional life looking at types of evidence that don't really support this kind of accepted model of the Bronze Age. So looking at settlements, for example, which present a quite different and alternative reading of Bronze Age life, in which competition between warrior elites is actually really quite far from everyday experience. And even in the nucleated and organized settlements of Central Europe, there's actually a lack of real kind of convincing evidence for social differentiation. And I've also tried over the years, and I realized when I put this slide up that actually I think I made this point about 20 years ago, getting old, that even looking at Bronze Age burials, it's not all about power and status. So I've talked about how these three little copper rings from the burial of a young child, might have been gifts from the mourners, expressions of affective ties and of the emotional impact of the loss of a child, rather than thinking of them as purely items that express or maintain social status, which I guess is the kind of standard narrative. So I suppose that the impact of colonialism has been profound, but I think it's been really completely unrecognised in studies of the Bronze Age, or more or less unrecognised in studies of the Bronze Age. I suppose that archaeologists working in other cultural contexts, outside of Europe in particular, are really used to thinking about the impact of colonialism on our narratives of the archaeology of different regions. But in Europe, I guess we tend to think that, why would colonialism have in any way impacted our research on prehistory in this part of the world? But I guess what I feel is that actually the kinds of cultural categories which we use to approach prehistory are very much influenced by colonialist narratives. And in that sense, I suppose that one of the things, I've been effectively trying to kind of decolonize the Bronze Age for, decades at this point. And I suppose that part of the rationale for my current project on animals is that this might provide a little chink in the armour and provide a kind of an oblique way in which to, a vantage point from which to critique these models of centralised elites, kind of massive male warrior elites, intensifying agriculture and innovating with bronze technology and so on and so forth. So I suppose in that sense, my project on animals is an extension of previous work. I've done a lot of work, a lot of research on deposition and also on mortuary practices and on the treatment of the human body in various different, mortuary and settlement contexts. And I've often noticed over the years, I've kind of, noted it in passing, but not really ever had an opportunity to get into it, that there's a lot of really interesting stuff being done with animal remains too, with partial and fragmented and complete animal bodies. And what I thought was that perhaps looking at animals not as objects, as they're kind of rendered in the kind of normal narrative of the Bronze Age, they're objects of economic exploitation. But if we don't think of them as objects, but as active co-participants in Bronze Age society, then that might be a really productive way of critiquing the kind of accepted narrative. So I'm hopefully going to talk to you about my project, so Animals and Society in Bronze Age Europe. Got this ridiculous quantity of money to do something about this, so it's exciting and terrifying in equal measure. So I'm going to, I suppose, start out by trying to frame the theoretical perspective that I'm coming from. Then I want to tell you a little bit about the project and what we hope to do, and then I'm going to talk a bit about some of the material that we've begun to look at as well. So I suppose the first kind of thing I wanted to comment on briefly is the really interesting disparities in the way in which animals have been considered in European prehistory. So obviously there's been really fantastic body of work, critical work on animals in the Mesolithic, which takes over several decades now, taking a broadly posthumanist perspective inspired by the interdisciplinary field of animal studies. And those researchers have thought about animal agency, animals as persons, how animal ethology and the materiality of animal bodies and animal lives impacts the people who encounter them. And these have often been quite decolonial approaches, I suppose perhaps because of the parlous position of many hunter-gatherer communities in the modern world. And people writing on the Mesolithic, on animals in the Mesolithic, have often been really influenced by indigenous theorists, anthropologists, and philosophers working on ecology and environmental issues, I guess, because from our own perspective, this seems to be so much more front and center in hunter-gatherer lifeways, perhaps, than in farmer lifeways. And obviously, there's been a lot of interest in human-animal relations in studies of the Neolithic as well. The complexities and unknowns of domestication as an historical process have meant that human-animal relations have been a topic of considerable discussion and debate in Neolithic studies. But of course, certainly until relatively recently, a lot of that work has been focused on animals as, I suppose, symbols in Neolithic cosmology. Now, in contrast, studies of domestic animals in the European Bronze Age have largely taken the relationships between people and animals for granted. There tends to be a kind of focus on the economic significance of animals, describing their relative contribution to Bronze Age diet, discussion of secondary products, figure animals as kind of, I suppose, secondary products are figured as markers of technological innovation, a means of generating economic wealth that can be used in human strategies of social and political aggrandizement. And where animals are considered in other ways, they tend to be thought of as symbols of personal status in particular. So animals become, I suppose, they're either economic resources or they're symbolic and political resources that serve human ends. So there's not really any discussion of kind of animal agency or human-animal relationships in a more kind of critical sort of a way. And certainly if we think about the large number of papers on Bronze Age horses, for example, in comparison to Bronze Age cattle, I think that tells us something quite interesting about how we value, or how the value we ascribe to animals differs depending on whether, like horses, they're associated with martial identity and by extension masculinity, versus, boring ordinary animals like cattle and sheep, which are associated primarily with the everyday life of domestic world. So I suppose that my project is trying to do something a little bit different in the Bronze Age. We want to consider what it might have meant to live with animals, to pay attention to the embodied entanglement of human and animal lives. The primary domesticates obviously were central to the Bronze Age economy, but this has important implications in terms of intimacy, affect and care. For the majority of Bronze Age people, obviously, their lives would have been lived in close proximity with animals. The rhythms of everyday labour shaped by animal needs that might have included, amongst other things, taking animals to pasture or to water, keeping them away from crops, collecting fodder, milking, repairing fences and shelters, looking after newborn lambs, kids and calves, and bringing animals home at nightfall. Ethnographies and ethnohistories of farming communities indicate that such daily proximities and interaction result in intimate attachments, a deeply felt sense of connection and mutual acknowledgement that requires an ability to understand, communicate, and collaborate with the other. People living with animals, though not always, recognise them as subjects with particular characters and histories, whose capacity for intention and emotion draw them into relations of care and interdependence. And this intertwining of human and animal lives is underscored by shared histories of inhabitation, of connection to landscape, as well as by histories of mobility and exchange in which animals, marriage partners, and the dead make perilous journeys to maintain relatedness. So I suppose I'm going to start with a few examples from my own comfort zone, which is depositional practice in Bronze Age Britain. I'll talk about some other stuff a little bit later, hopefully. I want to consider what might happen if we use a slightly different lens to interpret some of these types of data. So here is the burial of a young woman from Cliffs End Farm in Kent. And as you can see, her head has been placed lying on the skull of a cow. And it seems to me that this bodily proximity might well be reflective of intimate interaction in life. The cow was 12 or 13 years old, and traditional zooarchaeological approaches would, of course, suggest that this animal was probably, at that age, had been kept for her milk. And, as I'm sure you'll know, research on lipids from Bronze Age ceramics has demonstrated high levels of milk consumption. But we haven't really thought about the implications of this for human-animal sociality or the embodied intimacies that this indicates. So this young woman was around 17 or 18 years old, and if we think about her age relative to the age of the cow, it's possible that she milked this cow for much of her teenage years at least, and maybe even longer. Ethnohistoric and ethnographic studies indicate that cows will often let down their milk for particular people only. Milkers sing to their cows as they work, and cows may not let down their milk unless they hear their favourite song. We know this from kind of ethnohistoric documentation. So through these kinds of daily proximities, people and animals come to be attuned to each other's moods and dispositions, and rich and emotionally satisfying bonds can develop. So we can imagine, for example, that this cow might have travelled with the young woman as part of her bride wealth, if she was married, so that the life of human and animal might have been inextricably interconnected. And we can think also about the framework of everyday practice and how milking cattle, activities like milking cattle or seasonal transhumance, seasonal patterns of mobility like transhumance, are often strongly gendered and linked to particular age groups so that they come to be a vital part of social identity. And we should also, of course, think about the agency of the animal. So at her age, the cow herself might have been the kind of matriarch who assumed the role of herd leader, for cattle are social animals who transmit knowledge intergenerationally. And it was perhaps for this reason that part of her body, and a significant part, the skull, was chosen for deposition. Now, this lens of mutual acknowledgement and sociality might also help us to understand animal deposits in non-mortuary contexts, like this one from Larkhill in Wiltshire, where there were 3 cattle deposited, complete cattle bodies deposited in a series of pits cut into a palisade trench that formed part of a series of Middle Bronze Age land divisions to the north of an area of contemporary settlement. And they were all elderly cows placed carefully into these pits in a manner not dissimilar from the 2 inhumation burials of people from the same site. One of the cattle had been polled, so its horns had been removed, which is suggestive, I think, of human attentiveness to the temperaments and characters of individual animals. And of course, their placement in the landscape also hints that everyday human-animal interaction, as well as the exchange of cattle in extended webs of kinship, was no doubt central to the creation of relationships with land. In communities practicing small-scale farming today, cows that have reached the end of their reproductive life are usually consumed, but these ones haven't been, which is quite interesting. And I've been trying to think a little bit about, what might that mean? And there are certainly interesting, ethnographic parallels that you can draw on. So in other cultural contexts, for example, particular individuals are sometimes identified as sacred animals who shouldn't be killed, who are responsible for the well-being of other animals and humans in the community. And I wonder whether we've got a series of, 3 generations of sacred cows here who've been kind of looking after the community in some way, and they're deposited at the end of their lives. Now, that's all very lovely and friendly and, so on, but obviously it's really important not to over-romanticize human-animal relations. And just around a few hundred metres to the south of those cattle, there are 4 sheep buried in a line of 4 pits bisecting the entrance to a settlement enclosure. Now, these animals were much younger, so 2 were between 1 and 2 years old, and the other 2 were around 3 or 4 years old. So these these sheep, unlike the older cattle, are unlikely to have died a natural death, and in fact, one had been decapitated. So here we've got a situation that perhaps speaks of sacrifice, and this raises, of course, a series of very different issues. And of course, there's no doubt that animals were sacrificed in the Bronze Age, and they were also consumed. And consumption and sacrifice are acts that speak of violence, of the disparities of power between people and animals, for those animals, of course, had no choice in the matter. However, I think it is worth unpacking those relations of power, because we can't assume that they took the same form as human-animal relations in the present. Modern factory farming obviously denies the personhood of animals in order to legitimate their killing on an industrial scale. But of course, we know that in many other societies, the ethics of killing, eating, and sacrificing animals are considered in very different ways. The gift of the animal may be acknowledged by respectful treatment of its bodily remains, for example. And it is true, of course, that a lot of this kind of work has been done in hunter-gatherer societies, but I think there's actually plenty of evidence for mutualistic relationships with the natural world, including landscape, in the Bronze Age. So this is a little pot which had been stuck in a cleft in the rock of a tor on Dartmoor, and I always think this kind of materializes kind of relationships, intimate relationships with ancestral forces embedded within the land. That's my kind of interpretation of this find anyway. So I suppose we can think about how nurturing animals creates bonds which can result in grief when they're killed. But it's love that makes an animal's sacrifice meaningful. So animals and people in many communities are seen to nurture each other in reciprocal cycles of indebtedness. That's not to negate, of course, the disparities of power, but rather to think through them a little bit more carefully. Living with animals requires choreography, after all. Collaborative acts of understanding and attunement in which people must respond to animal needs and desires. Recognizing individual animals as more or less mischievous, patient, clever, bad-tempered, with whom a certain level of negotiation is required in order to live well. In other words, power relations between people and animals were not fixed or unidirectional, but themselves require unpacking and consideration. And of course, this is particularly I have a little nod to Anwin up there, Must Farm. This is, of course, particularly the case where human and animal space is shared. So there's been some really lovely work by Christian Armstrong Oma on longhouses, Bronze Age longhouses in Norway, and indoor stalling that suggests that animals there were considered to be members of the household. In a Bronze Age, or in a British context, the architecture of Bronze Age houses and Bronze Age settlements is less conducive to identifying where animals were housed and whether they shared living space with people, but occasionally do get very nice evidence, as, of course, the well-known example at Must Farm, where the catastrophic fire that burnt the houses down also claimed the lives of a number of young lambs. As you can see there were complete bodies of young lambs, along with lamb or sheep droppings found in several of the houses. And the recovery of their remains from the rear left of these buildings suggests that they may have been kept in small pens inside these structures. This kind of proximity, I think, speaks of mutual recognition, care and attention, and the everyday pleasures of engaging with animals. Keeping lambs in the house for a period it's a way of familiarising them to human handling, and it also ensures that the ewes will return regularly to the settlement and can be milked. And lipid analysis on the pots from Must Farm does indicate that milk was consumed. So I suppose that's a little bit about the kind of theoretical perspective from which I'm coming, but I want to talk a little bit more about the project now. We're just over a year in. We've almost recruited everybody. Some people have started very recently, and some people are, well, I think our last person is going to start in June, so that's very exciting. So we're nearly up to having our full team. So it's a multi-proxy perspective on human-animal relations with a lot of different, we're trying to kind of bring together a lot of different types of evidence, different strands of evidence, and there's a lot of archaeological science in there, which you can see, and that's a bit of a challenge for me, because I'm not a scientist, and it's a new departure, because firstly, I've never worked on animals in the Bronze Age before, and secondly, I'm not an archaeological scientist, so it's been quite a steep learning curve. And I have to say, when my lovely geneticist and chemist and geoscientist colleagues speak to me about what they're planning to do, I go, So anyway, hopefully I'll get my head around it eventually. I'm very lucky to have fantastic people to collaborate with on the various different types of data that we're hoping to bring together. So I suppose in a kind of a nutshell, on the one hand, we're trying to reconstruct the routines of everyday life, because I suppose from a kind of a practice-based perspective, we're thinking that the routines of everyday life are those on which social identity and ontological understandings of the world are based. So we're looking at animal management, animal mobility, and animal breeding. So animal management, loads of different things. So not just thinking about whether animals were kept for meat, milk, or other secondary products, but thinking in depth about how that affects the character and modality of human-animal interaction. We're looking at diet, so things like whether there was supplementary feeding, for example, with leafy fodder or millet. We're looking at weaning, so are humans and animals sharing milk or not? Birthing seasonality, which of course has a significant impact on the organisation of human and animal labour, and we can think about how that's related to aspects of gendered identity or other aspects of social identity. Animal mobility, understanding the daily and seasonal patterns of human-animal interaction, which hopefully will illuminate animals' relationships with people. So we're going to use isotopes to reconstruct seasonal and life course mobility, but also think about spaces of encounter and interaction in the house, farm and landscape. And I suppose, you know, in the sense that spatial relations reflect and reproduce kind of social relations, I think that looking at space is going to be really important to understanding the rhythms, practices and sensory engagements that bound humans and animals together. These kinds of structured patterns of interpersonal and interpersonal encounter and sociality, I think are important in helping us understand not only how people and animals related to each other, but also the location of animals in Bronze Age cosmologies and systems of value. So, you know, we'll be looking at houses, we're looking at isotopes, we're looking at domestic architecture, but also beyond the house. There's a lot of really interesting features relating to animal movement within Bronze Age field systems. I'll show you some examples in a little while, which a small number of people, most famously Francis Pryor, of course, have thought about in relation to animals. So things like waterholes and droveways and races and drafting gates to sort animals into groups and so on. But there's not really been that much work done on those features. So there's a lot of really interesting kind of potential there, I think. And then animal breeding, so Dan and Alex looking at the ancient DNA. Obviously we can think about population dynamics and different types of animals. We can think about selection for specific morphological or behavioral traits, things like, you know, woolly versus hairy sheep, or aesthetic preferences like coat colour that might relate to aspects of regional identity, for example. Relatedness, which may illuminate patterns of intersite sharing and exchange. Wild introgression, which again might tell us something about, obviously, animal management practices, but also the place of animals in the kind of social and conceptual landscapes of the Bronze Age. And then disease as well, which, you know, there might be interesting things going on with disease with the shift to indoor stalling. Having said that, a lot of this is kind of slightly pie in the sky, and I'm kind of thinking, you know, hopefully we can do all this, but certainly things like disease and relatedness in the genetics are going to be quite hard to pick up. So we may, if we do manage to do that, to pick up these things, we'll have been quite lucky. But it's good to aim high and, you know, see what happens. So that's on the one hand thinking about kind of everyday interaction in life, but then also thinking about how cultural categories and social relationships are reflected in the treatment and depiction of animal bodies in death and beyond. So butchery, use, consumption practices obviously encode social meanings and values. The selection of specific skeletal elements for the production of artifacts, for example. Depositional practices, which I've talked about a little bit already, were human and animal bodies treated in different ways, for instance. How does the deposition of cattle and sheep compare with other animals like horses and dogs, or wild animals, for instance? And then animal iconography as well is something that we're interested in too. So, geographical scope of our study. My sort of three areas that I have been thinking about were Bronze Age Britain and Ireland. So Britain and Ireland, the Low Countries in southern Scandinavia, and then I suppose the northern Carpathians as well, potentially southern Poland and a little bit further south as well. And my rationale for that is, well, in Britain and Ireland you have, well, certainly in Britain at least, also to some extent in Ireland, you have circular domestic architecture and you have field systems. Certainly the British field systems have a lot of really interesting animal management features. In the Low Countries in southern Scandinavia obviously you have rock art involving featuring animals, so there's interesting animal iconography. In the Low Countries and southern Scandinavia you also have longhouses, which often seem to have indoor stalling of animals. We don't know whether, apart from Must Farm, we don't really know the extent to which animals were stalled indoors in Britain and Ireland, for example. And then, you know, I suppose those regions all have quite dispersed, scattered farmsteads. There's not that much evidence for a nucleated settlement, although it is there. So I was also looking for another region, hence my kind of Central European focus as well, where I could look at animals in nucleated settlements And I suppose my assumption is that people are going to live with animals and manage animals in quite different ways if you're living in a nucleated community. So that is my kind of rationale, for better or for worse. And we spent quite a lot of time over the last year. We started about a year ago. We spent a lot of time over the last year trying to focus in, find good sites for sampling, and find good assemblages where there would be contextually well excavated, good, well recorded assemblages that are also well preserved, appropriate for various kinds of scientific analyses that we hope to do. So we've started doing some of our sampling. Unfortunately, because we're kind of some of the samples are in the labs, but we don't yet have any results, so I can't yet give you any results, unfortunately, but hopefully another time. But we've started out sampling in Britain, so these are a few sites from just south of Cambridge, and here we've got 3 pretty much contemporary Middle Bronze Age settlement enclosures excavated by Oxford Archaeology East, or rather I think they're Oxford Archaeology Cambridge now, and Cambridge Archaeological Unit. And you can see they're set within these really, really interesting enclosures and droveways and other fascinating things going on there. So we've already collected our samples from these sites, and hopefully we'll do some more in Britain as well. But what I wanted to talk to you a little bit about today is some of the Dutch material. We're heading off in about a fortnight's time to do our site, our collection of samples from the Netherlands. And this has actually been really, really interesting because, I mean, I don't know, some of you may know a lot more about Bronze Age archaeology in the Netherlands than I do. I thought I knew it quite well, but I hadn't realised there are these phenomenal Middle Bronze Age and Late Bronze Age field systems in this region of the Netherlands. So this is there's been a recent construction of a large motorway, effectively. So there are a lot of really nice, well-excavated Bronze Age sites with fantastic assemblages of animal bone from this little region, West Frisia up here. So we're going to go and collect lots of samples from a series of these sites, including this one here. So you can see, I mean, what a site. That's pretty amazing. It's also slightly terrifying because it's quite difficult to work out which of these enclosures and droveways and so on are actually contemporary. So trying to unpick the features is a bit of a challenge, but it's a good one nonetheless. So I'm going to talk about this guy here. This is a cow burial. I'm going to put the cow in context. It's not actually sexed, this one. So that is this site here, Markervaardweg. And you probably can't see, but the blue is cattle, and so the blue is cattle, and I guess I can't quite read it here either. I think the purple is pig, I can't quite, I guess the orange must be sheep, goat. The brown, I do remember, is, the purple is dog, the green must be pig, and the brown is wild animals. So you can see it's really dominated by cattle, this particular site. And I should say, actually, that what I'm going to talk about for the remainder of the talk, I want to thank my various colleagues, Fleur Huisman, Kate Caney, and Ellie Swallow, who've been looking at these sites. So these fields are kind of Middle Bronze Age, Middle Late Bronze Age. I knew about the classic Celtic fields of the Iron Age a little bit earlier. I was familiar with these. People like Stein Arnoldussen in Groningen have been working on the classic kind of well-known Celtic fields of the Dutch Iron Age, but I hadn't realised that there were such extensive Middle Bronze Age field systems, so they're really interesting. These sorts of field systems, they occur at all sites in this region, so it's quite an extensively managed landscape. And this particular example is quite irregular, kind of aggregated in form, but there are a lot of kind of coaxial types of fields as well. And if we look at the fusion data and the dentition, this indicates that there's a peak in mortality around 2 years, but there's also a lot of cattle over 4 years old. So probably there is milking, and I think there's lipids from these sites that indicate that milk was consumed. there are also quite a lot of traction pathologies. So if you think about cattle being kept for meat, milk and traction, then certainly if you're milking cattle and you're using them for traction, then you're going to develop quite interesting and close relationships with those animals. So let's have a little look at this cow. Now, my PhD student, Ellie, she noticed that this cow seems to have been deposited in several portions, several different portions, possibly, well, maybe at the same time, but possibly in a series of separate depositional acts. It's certainly not a complete body. It's partially articulated, but not fully articulated. And we can say that different parts of the body had different kind of pre-depositional itineraries. So the torso was largely excavated in articulation, and you can see it pretty clearly there. There was no evidence of butchery, gnawing, or weathering, but the head and shoulders of this animal have been deposited at the tail end of the animal. So, and there's a cut mark on the inside left of the occipital condyle as well, which is indicative of the head having been decapitated. So the head seems to have been removed and placed at the sort of lower part of the body. The limbs are not in articulation with the torso, but they seem to have been removed for secondary processing. There's a cut mark on one of the ulnas, which indicates that it was butchered for consumption. And there's also dog gnawing on the humerus. And we can think of, I suppose, going back to this idea that animals might have been members of the household, then we can think of the household in the broadest sense has consumed this cow. One bone was also calcined, so some of the bone appears to have been butchered and consumed, but some of it wasn't. And the taphonomy is also quite varied. There's dry fractures on several of the long bones, but not on other bones. It's not actually evident whether, we don't know yet whether those are pre or post depositional, but one way or the other, some bones at least seem to have spent time elsewhere, but then been reunited with the torso of this animal. So I suppose the interesting thing here is that if you've got kind of different itineraries for different parts of the body, or if we're looking at several episodes of deposition, that's not absolutely clear yet, then this body has been reassembled, which suggests that the remains were still recognised as belonging to that animal. So even though they've been transformed through butchery, consumption, etc., they're not quite objectified. So animal personhood is still being recognised in some kind of a way. But that said, there is still this strange head position, and maybe this was a deviant animal of some sort. We tend to think about deviant burials for people, for example. This animal hasn't been buried complete like other cattle on the site. Maybe it was a fractious animal. It's been culled fairly young. So there's something a little bit different and interesting going on here. And just to locate this animal in space, so a lot of these landscapes, obviously, so West Frisia is a quite damp, low-lying landscape. It's been a lot of it has been reclaimed, so there are a lot of later drainage ditches and so on, which makes it doubly difficult to actually work out what's going on with the animal architecture. So it's very difficult to identify whether the entrances that you're proposing to a particular enclosure are actually real archaeological entrances, or whether they're just an artifact of some later drainage ditch having been cut through, for example. But anyway, if we take out the drainage ditches for the moment, and we can have a little look at this set of interesting enclosures here, and just focusing in again into this little collection, you can see that there's all sorts of interesting things going on. There's a house here. Now, my colleague Fleur has interpreted some of these as droveways. This is fairly convincing. I think we'll probably have a chat about this. We haven't actually had a chance to discuss this yet, so I don't know when we all get together whether we'll agree that these are droveways or not. But certainly these little curvilinear enclosures set to one side of this much bigger, it's really, really big enclosure. It's hard to imagine that that's not something relating to stock handling, even if it's keeping animals out rather than in. And you also get lots and lots of hoof prints, which are really interesting. So these hoofprints, the sort of yellowy brown here is a concentration of hoofprints, and you can see there are various concentrations of hoofprints, these yellowy brown patches. And this patch of hoofprints is in a corner, the corner of a ditch. And I don't know, if you go out into the countryside today, you'll often find groups of cattle. They assemble in corners just like that. I mean, this is kind of animal cattle ethology, isn't it? Cattle behaviour played out in the archaeological record. And these are waterholes. And of course, cows need watering every day, unlike some other domesticates, of course. So the hoofprints are all around in the corner of this enclosure and around the waterholes, which I think is really, really interesting. And this is our cow here. This is the cow that I've just been talking about, just slotted in there at the edge of possible droveway. And I know this is very hard to see. I've just culled this image out of a PDF, so I don't yet have a better image, but hopefully you might just about be able to see some of these hoofprints. See the little cloven hooves there, and down here, and so on. So a lot of these West Frisian sites actually have really nicely surviving hoofprints. I'll show you a few more examples. So here, this is another site. This is, this is Enkhuizen, Kadeiken, Haling. So again, you can see it's quite disturbed with kind of later drainage ditches and so on. But if we take them out, zoom in a little bit, again, you can see lots of really amazing, interesting things which we're trying to work out at the moment. So presumably this is some kind of a big droveway, you know, just looking visually at this arrangement of ditches, it looks like it's a droveway. And there are lots of houses scattered amongst this set of enclosures and field systems. So down here, for example, there's a house. There's a kind of an open area here. We don't really know what this is for, but these little mini ring ditches, Dutch archaeologists interpret these as being for hay ricks, perhaps, to keep hay dry. So it's quite interesting. And you've got also a whole series of enclosures over here. But just to kind of zoom in a little bit here, an enclosure set to one side of the droveway, possible droveway. So here's your droveway running down here. Here's your enclosure. You can see that potentially there's an entrance here onto the droveway, though there is a ditch along here too, so you know that's a little bit up for debate. These kind of dark orange splodges are all hoofprints. You can see there's a fairly complicated relationship between them stratigraphically with the droveway, which we still need to unpick, but I think it's really interesting that you've got all of these hoofprints in and around this droveway. And you also have hoofprints in and around this building, this little rectangular structure. So maybe this is some kind of a stable, and maybe this is some kind of a yard. And Flora has suggested that there's some kind of a funnel shaped feature here, which might relate to maybe sorting animals or moving animals from one space to another. And then if we go a little bit further south, so this is the feature we were just talking about. Where has it gone? I've lost it now. Hopefully you can see it you've got a better angle from where I am. Anyway, that's it there. So that's the enclosure we were just looking at. And again, the kind of dark orange down here, these are all hoofprints, cattle hoofprints, and lots of them here in the droveway, which I think is really, really interesting. What we haven't got our heads around yet is whether, you can see there's this very kind of broadly, kind of linear arrangement of the hoofprints, which obviously kind of nicely aligns with the alignment of the alignment of the droveway itself. But we haven't yet worked out whether this is some kind of a feature of something going on later disturbance or something. It looks a bit strangely even to my eye. But one way or the other, there are lots of animal hoofprints within this droveway, which I think is really very interesting. Now, so now we've talked about cattle a lot, and I should say that we're really focusing on the main domesticates, so cattle and sheep. Though one of my postdocs is really into horses, so I keep having to kind of stop her from heading off into horses all the time. Reminder that we need to think about cattle and sheep. And, well, there are pros and cons to that. So on the one hand, focusing on cattle and sheep is good because I suppose previous work on the Bronze Age has tended to look at, predominantly either elite animals like horses or animals that appear to be important in kind of religious iconography, like water birds, for example. So there hasn't been that much interest in cattle and sheep, presumably because they're seen as boring, ordinary, everyday animals associated with the life of the settlement, which, is kind of where women did their boring stuff, So there's good kind of theoretical rationale for focusing on cattle and sheep. But on the other hand, it is obviously quite problematic because, we can't really understand cattle and sheep in a vacuum. We have to set them in their broader context of, how people are interacting with other types of animals as well. So, we won't know whether they're depositing cattle and sheep in an interesting way unless we understand how they're depositing other types of animals. But that said, also from a kind of a practical perspective, we have to, for quite a few aspects of the project are focusing just on cattle and sheep, because particularly with the isotopes in the ancient DNA, because my colleagues are particularly with the birthing, seasonality, and the weaning, and to some extent the strontium as well, my colleagues are doing such high resolution work that they can only actually look at a very small number of animals, of individuals. So Marie in Paris, Marie Ballas, who's going to do the weaning and the birthing seasonality, she thinks that she will probably be able to look at about 60 animals. And if you're trying, when you write these grant applications, like you say, I'm going to look at the whole of Bronze Age Europe from beginning to end. It's completely ridiculous. And then, of course, the practicalities are that you can look at 60 animals. So that is part of the reason why we've been spending so much time trying to identify really good sites, for trying to think very, very carefully about our site selection, because Marie wants about 20-25 animals from 3 sites across all of these regions. So hopefully we'll get her to do a little bit more. But that means that we're going to be building from, I suppose, a very kind of an in-depth understanding of particular life histories of particular animals and their depositional context within individual settlements. And we're trying to kind of scale out from that, or scale up to a broader understanding of human-animal relations in the Bronze Age. So that's challenging, obviously, but on the other hand, I suppose archaeologists are quite good at that. We do tend to, build enormous narratives from an individual pit or an individual burial. So I'm hoping we'll be able to do that too, but we'll see. But anyway, so my PhD student Ellie also pulled out this example as a really interesting one, and it's actually an elk, or in fact it's 3 elks. So this is the site at Houtepolder West. Fleur hasn't quite got round to looking at the kind of animal architectures, the landscape context yet, so I can't quite show this in its context, but this series of, 3 elks came from a little waterhole in there. I think this feature here is later. I think it's Iron Age or later. But you can see again kind of ditched field systems, and there are 3 elks in a waterhole. So they're actually 3 partial elk skeletons, and this is one of them here. They're all juvenile, though elk live to about 16 years in the wild. Again, just kind of putting this in context, Houtepolder West, cattle are again the most common animal, but there are quite a few wild animals, and in general in West Frisia there are quite a lot of wild animals in these assemblages. So here alongside elk there's also red deer, mallard, crane, white-tailed eagle, also fish, eel, perch, catfish. But anyway, back to the elk. So elk number 1 is a young male, about 11 months old, and there's a chop mark on the left radius, so maybe he was eaten, possible. Elk number 2 is under 3 years old, but probably towards the upper end, towards the older end of that range. And elk number 2 had unusual pathologies on the ankle. And the zooarchaeologist who looked at this assemblage suggested that the rear legs were tethered or hobbled. And then elk number 3 was just a few months old and had no pathologies or butchery or obvious taphonomic indicators. Elks 2 and 3 were deposited in the same layer, kind of midway down this feature, this waterhole, and both were minus their skulls. Elk number 1 was in an upper layer of the waterhole, so it had been deposited a little bit later, which suggests that people remembered the earlier deposit and that the type of animal being deposited was important. The elk in that upper level did have a head, its skull was present. And these animals were also found alongside two grinding stones, which I'll show you in a second, which were found together, but they weren't a pair, and both had long histories of use, but they weren't broken, so they were in principle still usable. And one is very visually distinctive. It was made from banded gneiss. And the excavators interpret, and this is that visually distinctive grinding stone there. So the excavators interpret this as a kind of a symbolic bringing together of the worlds of hunting and farming. But I think that does kind of impose quite a problematic wild domestic dichotomy onto the past. We don't know that the elk were hunted. Maybe they were semi-domesticated if we go back to that idea of, you know, one of these animals being tethered or hobbled in some kind of a way. And we can certainly suggest that there's some kind of a relationship of mutual recognition, knowledge and engagement, which might or might not resemble what we think of as domestication. And maybe we can think of this in comparison with more recent circum-Arctic interactions with animals like reindeer, which to a greater or lesser extent are left to their own devices, but are occasionally used as pack animals or even to ride. And it's also worth pointing out, of course, that elk are water-loving animals. So it's quite interesting that they're in a waterhole, which is maybe the kind of place that animals might have encountered elk in the landscape. So I suppose, hopefully, good, more or less on time, that's good. I hope I haven't gone on too long. So hopefully you can see that there's really interesting potential to look at the kind of osteobiographies of individual animals and to think about how these might have interconnected with those of people by bringing together multiple different sources of information. And if we go back to Cliffs End Farm, there's already been strontium and ancient DNA done on quite a few of the individuals, the human individuals from this large mortuary feature. And we're hoping that we can go and do a little bit more strontium and ancient DNA on the cattle. And I think there's some lambs as well in this big feature too. And bring these disparate sets of data together to consider the interconnections between human and animal lives. So how might they have travelled and encountered the landscape together? How might their daily and seasonal patterns of activity have informed and shaped one another? We can see that the cow's head must have been fleshed when it was put in the grave. So it is easy to imagine that this cow was sacrificed to accompany the young woman. Except for the fact that there are also partial human bodies and disarticulated human bone from elsewhere in the same feature. And, you know, it is quite interesting just to think about the different interpretive frameworks that we apply to human and other bodies. But anyway, that's probably something for later in our project. I suppose what I'm hoping is that the range of evidence that I've just kind of hinted at today will challenge us to think afresh about forms of interspecies interaction and engagement that are often quite alien to us now. I think, you know, we can think about Bronze Age ways of becoming with animals. And yeah, hopefully we will eventually have some more results. So a little bit early on in the project, but hopefully you can get where I'm coming from at any rate, and look forward to having a more informal discussion. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. That was fascinating. So I think we've got time for some questions before we go to even more informal discussion over drinks. So if I can maybe start, I mean, you've drawn on ethnographic evidence of different kinds. Is that sort of hinting at some patterns and things that you're hoping to pick out in the archaeological evidence that might ground you a bit more?
Exactly. So at some point we will get round to looking at the ERAF data files. So one of my postdocs has some good experience in working with that, previously looking at dogs in a different cultural context, but potentially this is the human relations, what are they, area files, I can't remember. Anyway, I'm sure most of you know what I mean, and they're electronically available now, and you can search for consistent patterns in particular phenomena, for example, so hopefully they might be useful. But it's interesting that, as you probably know, there's loads of really fantastic ethnographies of people, human-animal relations in hunter-gatherer or herding communities, but very few in more kind of agricultural farming communities, which I think says a lot more about us than it does about those communities. You know, I think it's actually really interesting.
Any other questions? Yes. Microphone.
So I was interested in how you're approaching scale in terms of herd size. So arguably you could say that the size of the herd would be in inverse proportion to the kind of closeness of the human-animal relationships. You could make that argument. So yeah, I was just wondering because I think at Clay Farm and AstraZeneca, if I remember rightly, they've got evidence of they've interpreted it as having quite large herds at any one time. Yeah,
they have. That's right. And I'm not totally sure if I agree. Their lovely model, which they suggest that because the architecture looks so designed to control large numbers of animals, that what you're looking at is animals out on the range, kind of semi-feral, being brought in occasionally to be managed for whatever reason, but they're mostly off doing their own thing. And therefore you need these big, substantial droveways and features to control animals that are not used to being handled. But actually the mortality profiles, there are quite a lot of older animals which would be suggestive of milk consumption. Obviously if you're milking animals, then there is a much greater level of familiarity. But you're absolutely right, it is really interesting thinking about that. And certainly if you compare and contrast the kind of earlier Bronze Age where you don't have field systems and the later Bronze Age where you do, presumably people in the early Bronze Age with their herds of cattle, or you're probably talking about relatively small numbers. I mean, this is obviously very hypothetical. You're probably talking about relatively small numbers of animals being managed through, people, maybe children, who knows, people herding their cattle in a very kind of a close way, as opposed to them being off in a field system at a distance. So there are certainly really interesting things to think about there in terms of those differences, and I'm sure there will be differences between regions as well, which hopefully we can pick up.
Thanks.
Hi, there were some lovely examples there. I was just wondering if you're starting to get a sense of change through time over the Bronze Age yet, through all your sort of rummaging through reports, say, for instance, in the sort of relationship of care that you're picking up on.
Yeah, not yet. I think it's still too early days. Yeah, that would be really, I think it's going to be interesting to look at things like pathologies, for example, those kinds of things, and how do those change? Because the appearance of field systems is obviously pretty dramatic and a massive thing in terms of animal management. So, yeah, not yet. Yeah, hopefully at some point.
Yeah, great talk. How far are these species categorizations constraining, do you think? If people had relational connections with, a cow's always cows, and do they vary a lot?
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, I suppose from a kind of a heuristic perspective, if you're doing your isotope analysis and you've got to choose, 60 animals, you've got to make those choices based on those kinds of categories. But hopefully, looking at things like the depositional practices might allow us to unpick those a little bit more. But yeah, for sure, they could have been categorized in many different ways, one has to assume. And particularly, I think it's going to be relatively straightforward to unpick some of those dichotomies, like kind of wild domestic, for example. But I think it'll be equally interesting to think about, the extent to which those species categories are affecting practice in the past as well. I mean, I suppose there's going to be ethological differences between what we call species now that will have impacted people's ways of engaging with animals on a practical everyday basis. But for sure, I think we have to think critically about that. I think that's a very good point.
You're looking at quite distinct places over Europe. What was the environment like, the climate in these different places? Because that would have an impact on how you deal with the animals there.
Yeah, for sure. Yes, yeah. So, yeah.
Do you know exactly whether you had more wet in the Netherlands, for instance, and drier in the Caucasus, whatever?
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I think, I suspect that our Dutch example may be a little bit more similar to our Eastern England example than perhaps it would have been perhaps better to choose some slightly more different examples. But, for various reasons, that's how we've ended up. But yes, yeah, there will be, there is a certain amount of wetland actually in the region that we're looking at in Central Europe as well. There's sort of uplands and lowlands. And there's a fair amount of forest during the period there as well, whereas I suppose in parts of East Anglia and West Frisia it's fairly deforested. But there's good paleoenvironmental data for a lot of these for all of these regions actually, and a lot of plant macrofossils as well, which I think is going to be interesting in terms of thinking about things like hedging and the landscape in that kind of more kind of phenomenological perspective. But yeah, you're absolutely right. There will be kind of material and practical differences in the affordances of these landscapes, depending on things like forest cover and so on, which we should also be able to pick up in the isotopes, I guess, in terms of feeding regimes and so on, and where animals are what kinds of landscapes they're in. Are they in areas which have tree cover or more open or open grasslands or whatever? So hopefully we should be able to pick some of these things up too.
I can just yell. I don't think I need the microphone. Thanks very much, Joe. It's really interesting. I wanted to ask about the intertwining maybe of animal lives and just leave the humans out of the equation for a second and think about animals that live intimately together. So I'm thinking of the dogs that you have for many of these sites. And I don't think Gregor is here, but this idea of when herding dogs start to emerge and whether that is part of the story that you might consider and how one would go about it. I don't know, you get injuries of trampling dogs or something.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, there's certainly some Scandinavian rock art, which has been, again, Kristen Oma has interpreted a particular scene as human with a dog and some sheep. But that said, I was certainly very struck reading Natasha Finn's very interesting book on Mongolian herding communities, that their dogs, they don't use them for herding, they use them for guarding. So, it was like, my assumption would have been that if you had dogs, you'd use them for herding, but actually Mongolian pastoralists traditionally, and still don't today. So that certainly raised the question for me. So for sure, yeah, we're going to think about that as well.
I've got another question. At the beginning, you hinted that this might be a kind of way of starting to think maybe about human relations by starting with animals is something that was I guess, less touched on by other people so far, so a bit more of a clean slate. Have you had any thoughts about how the project might take you back to the human relations?
Yeah, well, I suppose it's my sense is that it allows us to deconstruct those kinds of dualisms on which everything else is based in the Bronze Age. If animals are co-participants in human social life, or co-participants in social life, I shouldn't say human social life, in social life, then I should say non-human animals. Anyway, then I think that really forces us to question our assumptions about, whether women are, bartered brides and traded as, things in strategies of masculine, networking or whatever they were doing. And, you know, I suppose I've written about objects as well myself too, but that's my kind of hope, that it can allow us to kind of critique those sorts of broader narratives. But we will see.
So, further questions you want to bring up, or we move to have informal discussion outside? Thank you very much again.